Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs War Room Update. We are incredibly on day number 243 of the war with the terrorists in Gaza. There are still 124 Israeli hostages being held by those terrorists in Gaza, some alive, some not alive anymore. The war is continuing on there ferociously. We're operating in Rafah, we're operating in El Borej, one of the central Gaza Strip refugee camps where we didn't really operate so much before. I would venture to maybe to suggest that there are going to be some interesting pieces of news coming out of that operation in the near future. In the northern Gaza Strip, we're still fighting to make sure that we've cleared out all of the rest of the terrorists from the Judea area and really have made sure that we don't repeat what happened last time when the IDF pulled out most of its forces from the north and Hamas was able to regroup and reconstitute really its fighting battalions in the northern Gaza Strip. This is something that's all happening in this shadow of the plan suggested by President Biden that would really mean Israel losing the war, giving up to the terrorists. It wouldn't guarantee the immediate freeing of all of the hostages. It would leave some of them to be released at a later stage, dependent on the whims of the genocidal terrorists in Hamas. This is a bad idea, and it's something which, if implemented, will not bring about peace, but rather will embolden the terrorists and push them into more aggression and more terrorism, and probably, as they've committed to doing, into more massacres. That is something that obviously Israel should not tolerate. It isn't something which Israel should really agree to. And so the fine print, obviously, of that proposal will have to be coordinated to ensure that it really does meet Israel's critical security requirements. In the north, with Lebanon, we're fighting really an entirely different war. The attacks from Hezbollah have been growing in ferocity, in size, in quantity, and in quality over the last few weeks. And it's something which has required now much more of a strenuous response from the IDF, from Israel. The War Cabinet meeting last night to discuss the events of the last few days, where really the great parts of the north of Israel were set ablaze by barrages of rockets fired at our civilian population. In Judea and Samaria, we're continuing on also with the daily anti-terror, counter-terror operations, arresting dozens of terrorists. There we had an event just in the last few days where a terrorist ran into soldiers, killing 2 soldiers. He then turned himself into the Palestinian security forces, who decided, whilst this is a terrorist murderer, he should go free, and he was released by those security forces, those same security forces that enjoy extensive US funding and US training. They're not arresting terrorists. They're letting them go, reviving what Yasser Arafat famously implemented as his method to fight terrorism, the revolving door. One day you arrest a terrorist, the next day you release him. That's something which is continuing on constantly and obviously of much concern. But really what we're going to focus on today is a special day. Today for the people of Israel, for Israel, is a festival. Today's English date, obviously the 5th of June, is significant in that in the early hours of the 5th of June, 1967, Israel launched its preemptive strike against Egypt and against Syria, destroying their air forces and therefore allowing the Israeli forces to move forward against that axis of evil that had been building up. If you remember, it started already in April 1967 with dogfights with the Syrian Air Force. It carried on with May 1967 with the Egyptians closing the Straits of Tiran, expelling the UN peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula, and really preparation for war to annihilate Israel. Jordan wasn't part of that plan initially. They had stayed out of that fighting. They weren't part of that axis to destroy Israel initially. But once the fighting started, Jordan joined in as well. And we know the results. Within 6 days, Israel had won the war conclusively. We had managed to push back the Egyptians all the way to the Suez Canal. We'd managed to push back the Syrians away from the Golan Heights. And the Jordanians had lost the area that they had illegally occupied, that they'd called the West Bank. It's really called Judea and Samaria. When you look at even the petition plan from the UN in 1947, it talks about the hill lands of Judea and Samaria. The West Bank is a term that was attributed to the area by the Jordanians when they newly occupied that area. And in that context, obviously, the Hebrew date today is Kafchet Be'iyar, the 28th of Iyar. The English dates and the Hebrew dates don't necessarily match up every year. This year, they happen to be in close proximity. Kafchet Be'iyar is the day in the Hebrew calendar that Israel celebrates the reunification of Jerusalem, where we managed to, again, push back the Jordanian forces and to ensure that Jerusalem became part of the wider capital, undivided, eternal capital of the Jewish people of Israel itself. This is a situation that we've been in for the last 57 years now. And that's what we want to discuss a little bit today with our guest, with Chaim Silberstein, who, apart from being, I would hope to say that he'll agree with me, a friend, is also the founder and director, the chairman of JCAP, the Jerusalem Center for Applied Policy. It's really a think tank that focuses on Jerusalem, developing Jerusalem, dealing with the challenges of Jerusalem. We should just remind everyone that the terminology of East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem isn't terminology that we should rarely use. What we should use as the term is Jerusalem in its entirety. Jerusalem in its entirety has been Jewish for generations upon generations. At the very least, the 1922 British census for Palestine shows that in Jerusalem in 1922 already, Jews were the outright majority, more than the Christians and the Mohammedans, as they were referred to then, the Muslims. Jews had been living there for generations and generations. And so that was the situation when people now talk about occupied East Jerusalem. What are they talking about? They're talking about the area into which the Jordanian forces illegally infiltrated and illegally invaded, illegally held. And then now they try and say, well, Israel is an occupier of that area. It's not true, ladies and gentlemen. The Jews have been there forever, and they've been the majority in the city for many, many years. So Chaim, on that background, thank you for joining us on the program. A little bit of your thoughts of what's going on in Jerusalem today.
Well, as I say, Chag Sameach, Maurice, happy holiday, that we're now celebrating the 57th year of the liberation and unification of Jerusalem. And let's not also forget, as you mentioned, Judea and Samaria. Israel liberated an area 3 times its size at that time. We've already managed to give some of it away, but it was a very momentous and miraculous event that happened. And the reunification of Jerusalem is a very, very significant event, and certainly worth celebrating. If we recall, as you mentioned, Jordan illegally occupied Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank, and Eastern Jerusalem for those 19 years between 1948 and 67. And then we had this war basically forced on us with a preemptive attack, as you pointed out. We liberated those areas. Actually, in Jerusalem, it was not a preemptive attack. Israel sent a message to King Hussein, the young 34-year-old King Hussein of Jordan, saying that if you don't attack us, we will not attack you. And yet King Hussein, who was already a puppet of Egypt and with a military alliance, opened fire on Western Jerusalem. 26 Israelis were killed on that first day. And the Israeli army under Moshe Dayan as the defense minister in the unity government to which Gam Menachem Begin was also a member, responded, and within 2 miraculous days, on the 7th of June in the morning, 10:30 a.m. in the morning, the famous words, Har Habayit b'yadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands, and Jerusalem was liberated. And then the reunification process took place. At the end of June, the Israeli government under Prime Minister Levi Eshkol applied Israeli law to all parts of the united Jerusalem. Let's understand what it means to unite Jerusalem. Can I share a screen to show a map?
Yep, that would be excellent. Thank you.
I'm going to share the screen just to show you what the maps look like. Hold on a second. So if we take a look at this map over here, so we see the area of Jerusalem before 1967. You can see the yellow area which is the area surrounding Jerusalem, with Ramallah in the north and Bethlehem in the south, and the old city and the Mount of Olives in the east. All of that yellow area was the area that Jordan occupied during those 19 years, excluding Mount Scopus, the area where Hebrew University is today. That was an enclave that was still in Israeli hands, but the Jordanians occupied the rest of that yellow area. And Jerusalem was the area within the green lines, as you see on the map, and which is today, that area is known as West Jerusalem. After the war of 1967, this map is the map that we know today. And you can see the map that we're looking in front of us, which I call the Jerusalem geopolitical map. The new borders of Jerusalem, and the new borders are the black lines, and that is the expanded area of Jerusalem. Over 70 square kilometers were added to the area of Jerusalem compared to its original West Jerusalem size. So East Jerusalem under King Hussein was 7 square kilometers. And Eastern Jerusalem, the eastern part of Jerusalem, which is really, as you can see, north, east, and south, it's the area between the green and the black lines, is, instead of 7 square kilometers under the Jordanians, it's now 70 square kilometers under Israel. All of Jerusalem today is 125 square kilometers, of which 70, the majority, is the eastern, northern, and southern part of the city. The last thing I want to mention in this map is that the yellow areas that you see in the map are where Arabs live in Jerusalem, and the blue areas are where Jews live in Jerusalem. So you can see in the western part of the city, the absolute majority of residents are Jewish, and that's the original Jerusalem before 1967. And in the liberated part of the city, in the yellow and blue areas, you see there are about 350,000 Arabs, most of them Muslims, living in the eastern part of the city, and about 250,000 Jews living in various neighborhoods, starting from Neve Yaakov in the north through Pisgat Ze'ev and Ramat Shlomo, French Hill, Mount Scopus, where Hebrew University is, and then the areas in and around the old city. There are a few Jewish neighborhoods over there. And then we go down to the south, where East Talpiot is, and Gilo, and Har Gilo, Har Choma, and all together that makes up the Jewish neighborhoods in the eastern part of the city. So when we celebrate the unification of Jerusalem, liberation, unification, it really means taking the western part of Jerusalem that was extant until 1967, the additional 70 square kilometers that was added onto Jerusalem towards the end of June in 1967, making up what today we call a united Jerusalem.
Really much of that, Chaim, I don't know if you have it on a map, much of that, for just to give an idea for our audience, and those that are possibly less familiar with it, much of the map also reflects the topography of the area of Jerusalem and its hills around it, going towards the east, towards Ma'ale Adumim, for example, where just before it starts that really drastic as I'm sure many of our audience will know, that really drastic downward spiral towards the Dead Sea, towards the Jordan Valley, going towards, obviously towards the south, towards Bethlehem. Bethlehem, the big city, sits also in the valley that is possibly the southern border of Jerusalem. So really the map fits in with topography, and that's really how it was drawn, rather than just being entirely just coincidental as the green line, the original green line dividing the Jordanian forces and the Israeli forces was in 1949 and then on to 1967.
Correct. And in fact, as you said, as King David said, Yerushalayim Harim Savivla, Jerusalem, hills surround her. And in fact, the hills are what Jordan occupied and had strongholds on in 1967. And those hills we had to conquer first and foremost before we liberated the city. For example, the Mount of Olives, the area of Armona Natziv, where the Commissioner's Palace was. The UN sits today there on Commissioner's Palace, Armona Natziv, where East Talpiot is today. Tel El Ful, which is in the northern part. You can see over here on the map, just north of the old city, is the area known as Tel El Ful. The Jordanians had a stronghold there, which we also had to conquer in the first day of the war. And certainly, as you said, in the southern part of the city, they used to call it the sausage outpost near Kibbutz Ramat Rachel. So all of those high ground areas, Mount Scopus, Mount of Olives, Ramat Rachel, Tel El Ful, all of those high ground areas had to be conquered before we could actually send in the paratroopers into the old city and the Mount of Olives, Mount Scopus, to liberate the old city itself. And that all happened within less than 2 days.
So when we're talking about really if we can move, Chaim, with your permission, to modern day, Israel
Yes.
Liberated these entire areas. There are dozens of new neighborhoods that have sprung up. Give us a little bit of a sense of what the Arab population was, if you can, already back then in 1967, as opposed to the Jewish population, which didn't exist, that had been, even from the old city, had been ethnically cleansed. And really how those two populations have grown, because we know that the Arab population of what's called East Jerusalem has grown tremendously since 1967. For our viewers, the Arab population of Judea, of East Jerusalem, of the area that Israel applied its law to, were actually offered Israeli citizenship. Some of them in 1967, some of them took Israel up on that offer. Many of them chose to remain just as residents of Israel. Just in the last few years, I recently worked not a small amount with the Ministry of the Interior, and it's possibly interesting to know that in the last few years there's been actually a growth of East Jerusalem Arabs who have been requesting Israeli citizenship. And when the East Jerusalemites are asked, the Arab East Jerusalemites are asked, where would you like to live, in a Palestinian state or the Jewish state? They've been asked by, there's a famous market researcher called Khalil Shkaki. He runs the Palestinian Center for Market Research. And a study that he published 2 years ago showed that most of the East Jerusalemite Arabs, who the Palestinians see them as Palestinians, when given the choice, would prefer to stay Israelis living in Israel.
Correct. So first of all, I want to just make a slight addition to your introductory remarks about the majority of Jews in Jerusalem. The first census was taken in around about 1864, when the French and British consulates were open. And even then, there was a Jewish plurality in Jerusalem. And the absolute majority happened at the turn of the 19th century, when the Jews had an absolute majority in Jerusalem. So you're correct. Many people mistakenly think that the Israelis, when in the Six-Day War illegally occupied and conquered Jerusalem and brought a Jewish presence to an area that was a so-called Palestinian city before then, that is nothing further from the truth. And so we had a Jewish plurality, which became an absolute Jewish majority in the city. And the majority of the Arabs came in the wake of the economic growth of the city by the Jews. And so the Arabs were drawn into Jerusalem to look for work and to live in the conditions that Jews created in that city. So that's first thing. And if we look at 1948, for example, in 1948, there were 100,000 Jews living in the city in 1948, and there were 40,000 Arabs living there. In 1967, when we liberated the city, when the Arabs had those 19 years to move in millions of Arabs, because according to the Palestinians today, it's the most important Arab city after Mecca and Medina. And it's such an, everything, rests on Jerusalem, Al-Quds. And the Hamas symbol shows Jerusalem. And to everybody, it's so important. Let's see historically how important it was for them, because the Arab population in the 19 years when they had full control of historic Jerusalem, Eastern Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, grew from 40,000 to 54,000. And the Jewish population in that same period doubled from 100,000 to 200,000. So, and not only that, other than King Abdallah, who was, as you know, assassinated in Jerusalem in 1951, on visiting Jerusalem by a Palestinian terrorist, right? Other than that, that visit of the Jordanian monarch, not one VIP Arab Muslim leader visited Jerusalem in that whole period of time. In other words, Jerusalem had really very little, if not no importance at all to the Arab world, and it only took on importance after the Six-Day War when Israel unified Jerusalem and made it their united city. Further than that, the Arab population of Jerusalem after 1967 grew from 54,000 to 350,000. What a bad job we're doing of genocide, Maurice.
It's genocide, of ethnic cleansing, all of these things that are of Judaizing Jerusalem, which has always been Jewish. When you talk about the Temple Mount, I'm sure you know that there's a flyer that was produced by the Supreme Muslim Council in 1925. It had been reproduced from previous years as well, where it says there is no question that the Al-Aqsa, that the Temple Mount sits on the Solomon's Temple. And yet today you have all types of voices that are trying to rewrite that idea and make that disconnect between Jewish history and the Temple Mount, and say, well, you people were only there in order to interfere with the Muslim rights, which isn't necessarily the case at all, as they've admitted. But that it never hurts the side attacking Israel that their claims don't necessarily have any type of historical basis. The narrative is what's important, and unfortunately what we've seen is that narrative, whether true or not, seems to have taken hold literally around the world, and now people see East Jerusalem as being occupied, and it has to become part of the capital of the future Palestinian state, when really that wasn't the situation ever in history, and that idea at the moment is something which is really a non-starter.
Right, absolutely. And we see that our enemies have, in a sinister way and a malicious way, have harnessed Jerusalem in order to try and unify the Muslim world, and in fact, the Western world too, against Israel in the malicious and libelous accusation that we are taking over Al-Aqsa one of your senior researchers in JCPA, Nadav Shogai, wrote a book about that, the Al-Aqsa in Danger libel, and to show very clearly that, on the contrary, Al-Aqsa is not only not in danger, but from my point of view, unfortunately, we have given over the Temple Mount to Jordanian, the Waqf administration, and we almost literally got to beg for Jews to go up there and to walk around there. We're not even allowed to pray. So that is a libelous accusation, but they are using, our enemies are using it in order to rally the Muslim world and indeed the rest of the world against Israel, accusing us of all kinds of violations of international law and other things, where in fact it's the opposite. We know our enemies, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad and the Muslim Brotherhood as the umbrella organization, together with its supporters of Qatar and Turkey, are really responsible for carrying out and promoting genocide and undermining Israeli sovereignty in a very big way in Jerusalem. Hamas's goal is not Gaza. Let's not fool ourselves. Hamas's goal is not Be'eri and it's not near Oz. Hamas's goal, which is an Islamic religious goal, is to conquer Jerusalem.
Without question. And as we know, on the Temple Mount itself is meant to enjoy this famous status quo, where nothing changes on the Temple Mount, and the agreement that was reached by Moshe Dayan soon after the Six-Day War. We're not really sure what that status quo was. I wrote a paper on that a few years ago, asking already what was the status quo, who agreed to it. There was a ministerial committee set up after the Six-Day War to discuss that status quo that never really finished its work. And what we've seen really in the last 30 years, the massive change that happened on the Temple Mount is not the destruction of the mosque, as the Palestinians would like to argue. It's not any type of danger to the Temple Mount, but rather the massive digging of Solomon's stables, an area underneath the surface of the Temple Mount, where they literally came in with diggers and destroyed archaeological artifacts, thousands of years old. I actually had really a tremendous pleasure to actually go and visit in Solomon's stables many years ago, and you're really blown away by the size of this mosque that they've now built underneath the Temple Mount using the original arches. It really is very, very, very impressive. Unfortunately, it came at the expense of thousands of years of archaeology, just entirely destroyed. And that's been really the major change on the Temple Mount since 1967.
Correct. And, the irony is that one of our advisory board members, Professor Moshe Sharon, he should live many, many more years. He's an octogenarian. And he is a real expert on Islamic scripts in the land of Israel. He's written encyclopedias in it. And he told me that he was invited into the Dome of the Rock, which inside the Dome of the Rock, that, the Golden Dome, there are hundreds of Islamic scripts in the interior walls of the Dome of the Rock. And he told me that he was invited there by the Jordanians and by the Islamic Waqf to document the Islamic scripts. So it's interesting, a Jewish guy who's documenting Islamic scripts for the Jordanians and the Islamists. But he told me a very interesting thing. He said, out of all the dozens and dozens of scripts that he found inside the Dome of the Rock, which was built in the 7th century, not once is Jerusalem mentioned.
That's incredible. But Chaim, let's put aside for a moment also the Temple Mount. Let's discuss a little bit of what's going on in Jerusalem itself, the populations that we have. I have possibly a hard question for you. Something that today Jerusalem celebrates its unification, and there's traditionally a march through the streets of Jerusalem. Young people, flags, singing, happiness, enjoyment. It goes down from Rehov Yafo, from Jaffa Street, all the way through around the old city. and eventually to the Temple Mount Plaza. On the way, it goes through the Damascus Gate. Now, the Damascus Gate is one of the seven entrances to the old city. We know that it is a scene of not a small amount of violence, of terror attacks that have happened there over the years. And so on the one hand, you have this area which is of tremendous historical importance. And on the other side, when you look at the other side of the road, roads that aren't paved, sidewalks that aren't paved, it doesn't look like Jaffa. It doesn't look like West Jerusalem. Where are we going wrong there with that approach to ourselves within Jerusalem?
Thank you for that question. With your permission, I'll give a little bit of a background. First of all, I want to, in honor of the festival of the Reunification of Jerusalem, Yom Yerushalayim, let's take a look at some of the demographics. First of all, for the first time ever, Jerusalem in 2023 surpassed the million people mark, million residents mark. And again, Jerusalem is the largest city in Israel by far. In Tel Aviv, which is the second largest city in Israel, has less than half the residents of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is by far the largest. Also in land size, it's 125 square kilometers, which is a large area. Of that 1 million the residents, according to some of the think tanks, there are approximately 370,000 or 380,000 Arabs living in the city. So that's almost 40% of the residents of Jerusalem are not Jewish. And that number is growing, it's not diminishing. And the reason why it's growing is because there is a ton of illegal Arab building in Jerusalem. Our organization, JCAP, Jerusalem Center for Applied Policy, is researching that illegal building, and we've already counted more than 30,000 illegal units built in Jerusalem, mostly in Eastern Jerusalem, and growing at a rate of 1,200 per year, which is just an unbelievable number. So we see that the demographics of Jerusalem is actually moving in favor of the Arabs and closing in onto 50%, which means that if in the next 5 or 10 years this trend continues, we could see ourselves with an Arab majority in Jerusalem. And even if they don't reach a majority, they could decide to participate in municipal elections, which they have not done up to now, bring on board with them Jewish political parties like Meretz, which sit in the Jerusalem municipality, and actually create a majority coalition in the Jerusalem City Hall, in the municipality, which could happen with an Arab mayor, probably a Hamas-backed Arab mayor, which could be the mayor of Jerusalem if we don't do anything about it. On top of that, those demographic challenges, we have a huge problem of foreign intervention, foreign hostile intervention in Jerusalem, and specifically Turkey and Qatar. These are researches that we are doing, and we currently also advising the Israeli government on these issues. Turkey and Qatar have poured in and are pouring in, mostly Qatar, but also Turkey, hundreds of millions of dollars to undermine Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem. And that means for free, renovating Arab homes in the old city, building new homes, financing the construction of homes, building mosques, giving stipends to Arab school kids to learn Turkish, and paying for thousands of buses during Ramadan and other times to come from all over Israel, using the Muslim, the Islamic movement organization, right? Using them to bring in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Arabs to challenge Israeli sovereignty and have them come to the Temple Mount and to the Old City. So we have many challenges, both from within to Israel's sovereignty and to Israel's governance in Jerusalem, and from without. Qatar, Turkey, I can show you even Iran, Iraqi sources, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, we're tracking these things. So therefore, I think it is incumbent upon us, for us to do acts which strengthen our sovereignty, which express our sovereignty all over the city. And therefore, this march that's going on this afternoon, that's going through Shar Shem, right? It's actually Shem Gate. In English, they call Damascus Gate, but it's Shem, which is a Jewish city in the time of Abraham, right? Going through Shar Shem and through the so-called Muslim quarter, which many of us know what used to be a Jewish quarter until 1948, until the Jews were evicted from there. Many thousands of Jews going through those areas attest both to the prominent and predominant Jewish majority that existed in Jerusalem before the Jordanians illegally took it over, and certainly today to show Israeli sovereignty throughout every centimeter of our united city. I think it's a very commendable march, a commendable act to do, and as long as the people that participate in the march do not do anything illegal and against the instructions of the Israeli police.
So, and even on that, you have to understand, and our viewers have to understand. I remember many years ago with the march for Jerusalem, they used to not go in through the Shar Shem, through Damascus Gate, but rather went all the way round the walls of the old city, going in through the Lion's Gate, opposite the Mount of Olives, passing by Rockefeller Museum on the way, and you really did see something incredible in that whole area. Just for our audience who have never experienced, a little bit off track, I apologize, it's my ADHD. For those of you that have ever had the opportunity to be in Jerusalem, for a few months of the year, there are actually music performances in what's called Chizkiyahu's Cave. That's really a huge cave area underneath the walls of the old city that was used in order to really to cut the original rocks for the Temple Mount. And now when you go in there, it's just this incredibly acoustic area. And so for any of our audience who are in Jerusalem, if you have that chance to go and participate in one of those performances, it really is something amazing. And so you're passing all of this history on the way, and you'll see. And so we've already been to a certain extent pushed back, and the demographics that you're describing are really quite worrying. So what is Israel doing really? What is the Israeli government doing to make that balance? Obviously, we can't stop, and I don't think we necessarily want to stop the Arabs from living in Jerusalem, from prospering in Jerusalem, obviously, as they are. So how do we also bolster the Jewish community to ensure that we don't lose that majority?
Thanks for that question, Maurice. And last night, or yesterday afternoon, we had a very special event in Jerusalem together with the Jerusalem caucus of the Israeli Knesset, chaired by Dani Luz from the Likud and Zev Elkin from the opposition. And we presented to them a few position papers that we've written on this, on the topic of lack of Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem, and some potential solutions in order to change the demographic challenges that we have. And JCAP, our organization, has suggested various options to the Israeli government, which we really hope and pray will be adopted, because, as I mentioned, if we do not do something pretty urgently, we could and will find ourselves as a Jewish minority in the united Jerusalem. One of the, first of all, an easy suggestion which has been happening over the years, and I've been lobbying for it for many years, is to increase the amount of Jewish building of residential units. Just to give an idea, a few years ago, only 2,000 to 3,000 residential units began every year for Jews, and now it's gone up to 5,000 this last year. And we are lobbying for even higher than that, 6,000 or 7,000, because we need to add on another 50,000 units in order to increase the Jewish presence and Jewish majority in Jerusalem. A second option that we have suggested to the government is expanding the municipal borders of Jerusalem and including the satellite towns that surround Jerusalem into the city of Jerusalem as a greater metropolitan area, just like we see in New York, in London, in Paris, in San Francisco, in Sao Paulo, and many other large cities in the world that have these greater metropolitan areas. And our suggestion is to incorporate Ma'ale Adumim to the east of Jerusalem, Givat Ze'ev to the north of Jerusalem, the Gush Etzion area to the south, and Mevaseret Zion to the west of Jerusalem, to incorporate them into a larger Jerusalem area, while letting each of those areas maintain a certain modicum of independence, like you have boroughs in New York, but at the same time to be part of a greater united Jerusalem. And that would add on between 200 and 250,000 residents to the Jerusalem municipality. Lastly, there are two Arab areas that were left out of the security barrier that was built around Jerusalem. One between Pisgat Ze'ev and French Hill, called the Shuafat refugee camp, and the other in the north of Jerusalem called Kafr Akab. And we have recommended to the government as one of the options to disconnect those Arab neighbors from Jerusalem and to set up separate Israeli municipalities in those two Arab areas, and they will be outside of Jerusalem, but still inside of Israel. In those two neighborhoods alone live 40% of all the Jerusalem Arabs. So if you disconnect them from the municipality of Jerusalem, and if you build 50,000 units in the next 10 years, which we're on track to do, and if we enlarge the municipal borders of Jerusalem, we can change the ratio, the demographic ratio of Jerusalem from 60 Jewish and 40 Arab as it is today to 85 Jewish and 15 Arab, which we hope will happen in the next 10 to 20 years.
I mean, some of these things, Chaim, we see happening on the ground, and you hear about them sometimes in the news. And sometimes I have the misfortune to watch the international news programs, and you hear the discussion going on about areas where it would seem that Israel has now expanded into areas which had never been there before. For example, you're talking about Givat HaMatos, the area in southern Jerusalem that's adjacent to or in between Har Choma on the one hand, Gilo on the other hand, before you get to Bethlehem. And what we said is that really that very, very clear topography. And that area was recently approved for extensive building. And that's happening all the time. And then you had all the representatives of the European Union and the UN complaining that Israel was building in Jerusalem and in East Jerusalem, even though, as you said quite correctly, it's really South Jerusalem. It's not East Jerusalem, but it's part of that wider area, and it's plans which I think, as you said, need to move forward in order to ensure that there is place to live and there is place to move. But we also need to take into account, I think, one of the problematic things that many of our critics deal with, and I haven't really found a good response for, is that when you mentioned previously there are some 30,000 illegal structures in Jerusalem, where is the law enforcement on the one hand? And on the other hand, what about town planning for those areas? Is that moving forward? Is there movement there? I know that Mayor Leon has actually put that on as one of his really important things on the agenda, to move forward with proper town planning. Is that something that's moving forward at all?
I don't want to depress you on Yom Yerushalayim, Maurice, but unfortunately the enforcement is almost non-existent. It has improved under Mayor Leon, I must admit, but just to give you an idea, I mentioned that there are 1,200 illegal Arab units built every year, and there are over 30,000 extant today. The city hall increased the building demolitions from about 50 to 60 a year to about 150 or 200 a year. So we see that it's gone from a minuscule amount to a little bit more than a minuscule amount of house demolitions. And those demolitions can often take up to 10 years to get the approval from the courts to do and actually to implement those things. So therefore, the enforcement is very low, and we are lobbying very, very strongly the municipality and the government of Israel to enforce illegal building and to plan the towns in such a way that makes Jerusalem a much more pleasant place to live. To give an example, many of the illegal structures in the Arab sector are built on public and park lands to the detriment of the quality of life of the Arab residents themselves. In addition to that, we are lobbying very strongly, and thank God the government of Israel is promoting new neighborhoods, like you mentioned, Givat Matos and Givat Shaked, and many other neighborhoods, by the way, which all of whom are in the eastern and southern and northern part of the city in liberated Jerusalem. One that I'm personally working on very strongly is in the Atarot neighborhood in the north part of Jerusalem, the old closed down airport, where there are plans to build 9,000 units for Jews, the largest Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem, which would also be a buffer preventing Arab contiguity from Ramallah into Jerusalem, and also provide an urban planning solution to the fact that so many Jews are leaving Jerusalem because of high real estate prices. So on the one hand, to increase enforcement against illegal Arab building, on the other hand, to increase Jewish building and create new Jewish neighborhoods, not only to build upwards, but to build outwards also. There are at least a dozen new Jewish neighborhoods or large Jewish residential projects planned by the City Hall. And I think if all of those are implemented, we will see a drastic change in the demographics of Jerusalem, with the Jewish majority increasing in size without inflicting any democratic just injustices to the Arab population of Jerusalem, who are residents, permanent residents of Jerusalem, and equal under the law.
I think really that's the imperative for the government at the moment, to make sure that there is equal opportunities, both for the Israeli Arab residents of Jerusalem, for the Jewish residents, taking into account that this is at the eternal capital of the Jewish people, united and never to be divided again, I hope. And so things need to be done in order to make sure that we can really maintain that reality in the long term, and really decisions have to be made very, very soon. Chaim, unfortunately, we've run out of time. What I like to do is to ask our guests to give us one additional positive idea going forward, what we can expect in the next 3 years, 5 years, how Jerusalem will look, how it will grow. I don't know, you can mention maybe the cable car being built from Silwan going up to the old city. There are so many amazing things going on in Jerusalem at the moment. They're really the picture of the city is changing all the time.
I think that we can be very optimistic. You know, the prophecy of Zechariah, who said, old women and children will be walking in the streets of Jerusalem. It's amazing to see the realization of those prophecies, and we just need to harness it further and further. As I mentioned, to increase the residential building is imperative. To increase the cultural landscape of Jerusalem, the yeshivot, the Jewish studies, tourism is critical. 3.5 million visits a year, which is an incredible number. Jerusalem is one of the fastest growing tourist destinations in the world. So if it's the cable car from the Tayelet, from the promenade, and many other tourist facilities are available and are being developed. Biotech, high tech, the business environment is critical for the success of Jerusalem and the flourishing of Jerusalem, which is one of the poorest cities in Israel. And I think we, every one of your listeners, whether they live in Israel or overseas, are encouraged to come and to visit Jerusalem and to tour Jerusalem, not only in the classic areas, but all over Jerusalem, to get your own impression and to breathe in the holy air and to feel that fantastic feeling of the realization of the prophecies, the reunification of Jerusalem, and we just marching forward, I believe, to a much, much better future. But we have to be cognizant of the threats and the challenges that are facing us and deal with them as soon as we can.
Amazing, Chaim. Really, 57 years young, Jerusalem unified. And let's really hope and pray that this will be the situation that carries on for many, many years to come, and that we find really that golden path of managing to develop the town for the benefit of all of its residents, and something which really does give that spirit of breathing life into this ancient city. Chaim, thank you very much for joining us. For our audience, if you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, you can go on and subscribe. It's the little icon in the top left-hand corner of the JCPA website. If you feel so inclined, on the other side, there's the support us icon as well. Obviously, everything we do is done by donations, and we would happy to be able to partner with you in order to forward the best interests of Israel as the nation's state of the Jewish people in the wider Middle East, together with our brothers on the right to the east and the rest of the Middle East, and really as that bridge to the West, that combination of cultures that we so like to talk about. In the meantime, everyone, Chag Sameach, have a very festive day, and for the celebration of Jerusalem. We will be back with you again next week. In the meantime, stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, Maurice. Chag Sameach.
Bye-bye, Chag Sameach.